You. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. Senator McCain has graciously asked me to begin, and I'll try to return his kindness by speaking briefly. We have had a very good visit to Israel. This follows stops we made earlier in the week in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. I'm proud to be here with Senator McCain and my colleague, Senator John Thune of South Dakota and Senator John Barrasso, Wyoming. This group of four of us, I think, represents the broad, nonpartisan support for the security of Israel and a strong U.S.-Israel relationship, which, of course, we don't see as inconsistent to also supporting the aspirations of the Palestinian people. I will say that part of what we've found here is a picture that has two distinct images. The first is that on the ground, both in Israel and the Palestinian Authority, life is better for most people. In Israel, for instance, as Minister of Defense Barak said to us earlier today, there has not been a suicide bombing during 2009. That security is better. In the Palestinian Authority areas, the economy is growing and security is better there as well. And of course, that's very constructive and encouraging. I know there's concern about the status of the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians. I would say simply that the best thing that could happen is that both sides, without a lot of argument or precondition, get back to the table and start talking to one another. And that will test the will, the intention, the desire of each side to reach an accommodation that will serve the interests and values of both peoples. We had extensive conversation both in Israel and in our conversations with Prime Minister Fayyad and in our visits earlier this week to Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan about the threat that the extremist, repressive regime in Iran represents to the entire region. Senator McCain will have more to say about that. I just want to say briefly, as a co-sponsor of a bipartisan bill in the Senate of the United States, which would authorize the President of the United States to apply broad sanctions, including an attempt to stop refined petroleum product, gasoline, from going into Iran and unless they stop the development of their nuclear weapons program, and also related to their repression of the human rights and desire for democracy of the people of Iran. I'm hopeful that that legislation will come up in the Senate when we go back into session next week. It is sponsored by more than 3/4 of the members of the United States Senate, and therefore I expect strong legislation to be adopted and hope that it will be enacted soon and signed by the President, and that he will apply those sanctions to Iran as soon as possible. I'm honored now to introduce my dear friend and colleague, and really the leader of this delegation, Senator John McCain.
I'm very pleased to be back in the state of Israel and help reaffirm my constituents and the American people's support of the freedom and independence of the state of Israel. As an observer of attempts at peace here in this issue between Israel and the Palestinians, I have come to the conclusion that the Prime Minister in the state of Israel is right. It's time to sit down without preconditions and begin serious negotiations to bring about a lasting and permanent peace. On the issue of Iran, there is no doubt that the people of Iran have risen up and want a freedom from and a rejection of the extremist Muslim clerics who rule that country. One of the many ways that the United States can be of assistance is to help the Iranian people to communicate with one another, such as making every effort to help prevent the Iranian government from blocking the internet, from helping them communicate with one another to providing them with the means to organize. That does not mean military intervention, but it does mean speaking up every single day for the people of Iran and their struggle for freedom and democracy. The day a young woman named Netta bled to death in the streets of Tehran was the beginning of the end of the tyrannical regime in Iran, which threatens peace in the world, the region, and specifically to the State of Israel with their continued unabated development of nuclear weapons.
Senator Thune.
Thank you. It's great to be back in the State of Israel, and I serve on the Armed Services Committee with Senator McCain and Senator Lieberman. Very proud to work with them on these important national security issues. And we are, as has already been stated, very, very committed to the security and to the freedom of Israel. The United States doesn't have a better friend than the State of Israel. And we will work very hard to make sure that the Iran Sanctions Act does get passed, gets voted on and hopefully passed, and then ultimately implemented by the President when we get back into Congress. And there aren't many issues in the Congress these days in which enjoy broad bipartisan support. We seem to fight about most issues, at least when it comes to domestic policy. But the one issue on which there is broad bipartisan support is with respect to Israel and our relationship. And so I'm proud to be here and to be able to meet with your leaders and to talk about the issues that are important. We agree and share the concern that Israel has that a nuclear Iran is a game changer and is something that cannot be abided by our countries.
Thanks, John. Senator Barrasso.
I'm John Barrasso from the state of Wyoming. It is wonderful to be back into the state of Israel. Again, this is my third time here in the last 13 months. We've had very productive meetings today and along the entire extent of our trip. I continue to be a strong supporter of Israel. And with regard to the legislation that is in the Senate, I am one of the co-sponsors. As we have traveled and visited with leaders around this part of the globe, we've asked questions about what is happening now in Iran. And while some call it simmering, others call it ready to boil, I think anything that we can do to turn up the heat to bring the day closer when the regime in Iran is turned over and the people in the streets are given the freedom, the better it will be for all of mankind.
Thanks, John.
Rambusa AFP. I'd like to ask all of you whether in your talks with the Israeli leaders today and Salam Fayyad, whether you got the impression that peace talks or the sides are going to return to the negotiation table in the coming weeks, and whether the Obama administration's pressure on both sides is actually yielding results.
I'll start. The truth is, the honest answer to your question is it's hard to say. I think both sides, Prime Minister Fayyad, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Defense Minister Barak, all indicated a desire to return to the negotiating table and some optimism that could happen in the near future. But there's still a lot to be done. I think the U.S. administration is trying to play a facilitating role, but in my own opinion, the U.S. Can never force the Israelis and Palestinians to the negotiating table unless they want to go to the negotiating table and begin to negotiate in earnestness with one another for a better life for both peoples. We can facilitate such negotiations, but we cannot and frankly should not force such negotiations.
I have detected in my years that I have come here increased pressures to sit down and begin negotiations. One of the reasons is the continued buildup in southern Lebanon of Hezbollah capability. Another is the Iranian continued progress toward acquisition of nuclear weapons. Another is pressures throughout the world to tell the Palestinians as well, in particular, to sit down without preconditions. So I see increased pressures and increased urgency. But as Senator Lieberman said, the United States cannot force anybody to the table. We can only provide encouragement and promises of assistance to implement any agreement that is made between the two parties.
Ili Shahar Army Radio. What did the Prime Minister Netanyahu said about the other side, about the Palestinians, and did he say anything that he is willing to give in advance in order to renew the peace talks?
Well, of course, the answer to that should come from the Prime Minister. I think what I would say to you is that he said exactly what he said in public here, which is that he would like to sit down directly with the Palestinians. He feels that he has made steps in their direction, including the unprecedented partial limitation or halt in settlement expansion, that he has opened up some of the checkpoints in the West Bank, which have facilitated the economic growth and sense of security in the Palestinian Authority area. So he thinks that he's done some things that ought to encourage the Palestinians to come to the table, and I personally agree. The other thing he said, really quite insistently, is that these negotiations have to be one of his conditions for a successful conclusion of the negotiations is a formal recognition by the Palestinians of what I would have thought was recognized all along, but really is not, which is that Israel is a Jewish state, and that it is here to stay. I know those are not easy questions, but I would say that those were the significant points that he made while expressing his willingness to begin direct negotiations right away without precondition.
Just briefly, I think the Prime Minister is not only willing but eager to sit down, but I don't think it is much to ask to recognize the right of a country to exist as part of a way to reach agreement with one's neighbors.
What do you think about the method of pressure coming from Senator Mitchell, who just mentioned the loan guarantees as a tool to make Israel coming forward to the peace process? Do you think it's helpful or unhelpful? Is it not going to the mistake again of the trying to resume the negotiation that didn't succeed in the last 8 months?
I don't think it's helpful, and I don't agree with it.
Sorry, Ethan Bronner of the New York Times. Of what the Israeli Prime Minister said with regard to getting the Palestinians to the table, you also saw Prime Minister Fayyad. I assume you said those things to him. What did he reply to you?
Well, I guess again, you've got to talk to Prime Minister Fayyad for the full story. But look, there's a lot of regard. You're looking for the backstory, the partial story. I'm going to disappoint you, but. Look, to say the obvious, there is a lot of admiration in Congress for Prime Minister Fayyad, for his competence, for his work to develop the security forces within the Palestinian Authority area and to begin to assume some security responsibilities. Incidentally, we hear from Israeli leadership a respect for that. As well, and I'd say he desired to return to the negotiating table. But you know, there's a complicated political situation on the Palestinian side as well, and so that has to work itself out. But I think it's fair to say that he expressed also an eagerness to return to negotiations. Now, I can't say that was without condition, but. Nor is he unilaterally in a position to make that decision. President Abbas obviously will have a lot to say about it.
I'm Julie Stahl from CBN News. 2 questions. First of all, you said that things seem to be going well in Israel, no suicide bombings, they're going well in the Palestinian Authority, the economy is being built, we have no negotiations. Also, recently the pressure that was put on for the building halt, we understand that there's tens of thousands of Palestinians out of work because of that, and it caused problems in Israel. Is there any thought that maybe that the negotiations are not such a good idea? And also, if I may, regarding Iran, how long do you want these sanctions, to give these extra sanctions to work before thinking maybe they're not going to work?
Well, on Iran, I think that what we need to do is get a vote in the United States Senate. The House has acted on this. We want to vote on it in the Senate. It's a matter of getting the Democrat leader to schedule it. I think the administration has some concerns about it. I would certainly hope that if Congress goes on record in support of it, which I believe they will if it comes to a vote, that the administration will move forward with implementation. And I also happen to believe that it's important enough that we need to do everything we can to get the UN, the Security Council, to go along. But in the event that Russia and China don't come along, I think we need to move forward. We've got to do everything we can to put pressure on that regime.
And with regard to sanctions, you want broad-based sanctions, not something that's just going to hit a certain economic status of the country. You want sanctions that will have impact. You can drive up the cost of energy. That's going to limit some of the opportunities that the regime in Iran has. So you want to take a look at that way. You also want to see if there are things that you can do with opening access to the people to communicate to the outside world via the media, via the internet, those sorts of things to have more interconnection. All of those things, and take sanctions as far as you go. And you say, how long will it last? I don't know. But ultimately, you need to prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. You want to use sanctions until the point where you feel you've taken every alternative you can to prevent the nuclear weapons other than the ultimate opportunity.
I think this
I would like to get back to this statement made by Senator Mitchell. Now, he's not known as a person who just makes all kinds of statements just like that, but without calculations. To the best of my recollections, he always reads it from paper. Do you think there is some sort of a new trend in order to change or to shift the issue of financial support to Israel as a leverage against Israel? And if so, do you think there is a chance a move like this can go and cross Congress?
I gather that someone in the administration, unnamed, disavowed the statement of Senator Mitchell after it was made, or said that's not what he intended. I don't know about that. I can just tell you my own opinion, and I'll ask my colleagues if they want to comment. Any attempt to pressure Israel, to force Israel to the negotiating table by denying Israel support will not pass the Congress of the United States. In fact, Congress will act to stop any attempt to do that. I don't think we're going to come to that point because I think the President and his administration understand that.
Let me just say briefly, I have the highest regard and respect for Senator Mitchell. He was able to play a key role in the peace process in Ireland, which many people thought would never succeed. We disagree, obviously, with that comment, and I'm sure that you will see the administration in the future say that that's certainly not the administration's policy.
Thank you very much.